By lunchtime on a Tuesday that had been complaining politely about its existence, Norman P. Ledger was performing an act of administrative devotion he had practiced since adolescence. He had boiled tepid water in the communal kettle until it sighed with resignation. He had pressed the exact number of sticky notes 5, never 6 into a compact, precise fan, the way a person arranges small talismans against the possibility of chaos. He had, with almost ritual gratitude, snapped the lid back on his tiny stapler, the one that fit in the palm of his hand and felt like a comforting coin when he rubbed it between thumb and finger. He had annotated the margins of an internal memo in the only ink he trusted, navy blue. With a propensity to smudge, and he had cut his sandwich with the solemnity of someone filing a deed. The sandwich was straightforward, tuna with a scruple of mustard, resisting but not betraying the dignity of bread. It was a lunchtime sandwich, not a statement. It had been wrapped in wax paper stamped with the department crest, an appropriately dull escutcheon of scales, a quill, and something that might have once been a sundial. Norman had procured it with the faint thrill of a small indulgence. It lived in his bag, next to an emergency legal pad and a half-written poem, where the obsolete stamp had also been sitting since Monday, innocently lodged in a pocket like an old coin. The stamp, a quaint brass thing the size of a penny, had once been used only on the most solemn of documents and had been retired to a drawer on account of having a tendency to declare things complete with career-ending literalism. It was supposed to be ornamental now, a relic with an edge of nostalgia. It was not a dramatic accident. Norman did not fling the sandwich. He nudged it with the side of his hand as he reached for the tepid kettle with precisely the wrong combination of clumsiness and habit. The wax paper slipped. The brass stamp, which had been resting against a clipboard like a modest island, tilted and slid free. It clattered not loudly, but in that efficient way household objects have when they wish to be noticed, and fell across an old checklist that had been inherited from an archivist with a taste for unnecessary certainty. The checklist was the sort that had been written in a hand that did not quite belong to any current era. Its headings were underlined 3 times, and the penmanship suggested someone who took comfort in the repetition of their own rules. The stamp landed improbably exactly where the checklist's marginalia formed a particular vector. There was nothing cosmic about vectors to the Quarry 12 machine that sat in its cradle like an office dragon. The Quarry 12 was a sequencing analyzer, a machine designed in collaboration with half a dozen metaphysical committees and someone in procurement who preferred things with levers. It read sequences, validated authorizations, and occasionally asked soft existential questions about forms. It had been calibrated to the literal, and every organism at the department loved it for that literalness. Nothing in the department's history was worse than interpretive whimsy. The machine, which had seen more forms than Norman P. Ledger had seen poems, interpreted the brass impression across the network checklist as a complete activation signature. For a long moment, long enough for a pigeon to clear its throat and a paperclip to tremble on its coil, there was nothing. Norman blinked. The kettle sighed. The office hummed in its regular, indifferent rhythm. Then the teapot shuddered, and the office lights hiccuped as if recovering from an awkward joke. The monitor on Norman's desk printed a single line of text in a font that had not been used since the country first learned to believe in literal consequences. Armageddon protocol sequence initialized. It was the sort of phrase that on paper meant ceremonies and weighty seals. In practice, with all the finesse of a misplaced comma, it meant that the world had started to do things that were analogous to dignified coughing. The first anomalies were minor and encouraged laughter. Outside the building, a set of traffic lights blinked in a rhythm that, if one had the imagination for it, looked for all the world like Morse code repeating a short, apologetic message. A flock of pigeons performed what Clara Motes later insisted was a filing formation, a V shape that, when observed, gave the impression of a stack of envelopes being carried by the wind. A small island in the south, previously famed for its unremarkable beaches and tendency to make excellent marmalade, launched an initiative where citizens began to insist that all personal conversations be transcribed, signed, and stapled for quality assurance. The world was being politely absurd, and the department's coffee area filled with that exact pressure of underplayed astonishment which suggests a meeting is imminent. At first, Norman thought it was a prank. He looked at the Quarry 12 printout with the same face he used for arithmetic errors and lost keys. "It's obviously a mistake," he said, to no one in particular and to everyone. "It can't be real. The stamp is obsolete. Nobody uses it. It's a decorative thing." He tried to make the word decorative sound like an unimpeachable legal status, rather than a confession of aesthetic failure. Area Vos did not smile. There are people who smile the way machines do, with precise intervals and a sense of policy behind them, and there are people like Aria, whose expression reads like a highlighted memo. She walked across the office like a decisive footnote, red pen already half raised as though to underline her own authority. "Lockdown," she said crisply, as if reading aloud a line of an old play. "Norman, stay where you are. Gideon, halt the logs. Clara, secure the biscuits. Tom, stop looking like the entire celestial judiciary owes you money." Tumchok grinned, which was his default facing for any disaster that had an element of paperwork. "If it helps," he said, sipping from a thermos that contained something that might once have been coffee, "I always thought kitten protocol was the worst case scenario. This is theatrical." "It is not theatrical," Aria said. "It is a series of protocol breaches. That is far more concerning. The world is hiccuping," Norman whispered. The phrase made everyone look at him as though he had just offered an important statistic. It was true. Somewhere in the city a fountain stuttered, and a bus driver politely announced an unscheduled additional stop while arranging his timetable, as if apologizing to the universe. Gideon Furl had his tablet out and looked as if he had been waiting for the chance to look more alarmed than anyone else. He pulled up a series of logs that read like a history of nostalgia. "There's a sequence here," he said, "but it looks, well, it's been asleep for decades. The Quarry 12 just read an activation token." The thing is, he hesitated as though translating from a dialect only available to engineers and men who burn their toast. "This token hasn't been moved in 103 years. How does a brass stamp on a sandwich equate to a token?" Clara asked, already making a nest of paper towels as if the answer might leak. "Literalism," Tom said indulgently. "Machines are literal. They like rules. They are comforted by stamps. Give them a stamp in the right place, and they'll make you an apocalypse." The room laughed because the option to scream had not yet been fully socialized. Laughter is not a cure for Armageddon, but it is an expedient in the early stages. Somewhere between the second biscuit and the third printout, the anomalies accelerated. A school in a town that had been famous for nothing became momentarily obsessed with paperwork and began to hand out forms for recess. A mountain which, for reasons geological and bureaucratic, was always slightly smug, hiccuped audibly. And a resident flock of goats began to ring alarm bells in the distance with a dignity that suggested they recognized the gravity of administrative disorder. Profits, as Clara pointed out with the air of someone stating the obvious, were unavailable. They were on hold. Their phones, reportorial devices of the cosmos, emitted ancient and patient hold music that sounded, to those who listened closely, like an old sea shanty lamenting punctuation. The department responded in the way institutions have learned to respond to every conceivable contingency, by convening a meeting. People who had never been in the same room assembled with a certain officious dignity, as though by being together they could file themselves into a usable shape. Holbrooks guarded the break room door with the tough solicitude of someone who always wanted to be sure the biscuit supply wasn't endangered by metaphysics. Mita. Enoch the janitor appeared with a mop as if he had been summoned by the mood of the floor. He nodded at Norman and carried on as though his life had required only a slight increase in sweeping. "Area, what is the damage control?" Norman asked, because asking felt like doing. He felt stupid and useful. Those are compatible states in the same way that a stapler and a small poem are. Area tapped her red pen against a policy manual and did not smile. "We treat it as a misactivation," she said. "Containment, check logs, notify directorate. Above all, do not panic." "That's a useful suggestion," Tom said. "We will not panic in the presence of formalities. We will instead organize our panic into subsections." The first hour was pure protocol. The Quarry 12 cuffed up index cards. Gideon cross-checked timestamps. Clara handed out biscuits like morale permits. And Norman attempted to retrace the improbable trajectory of a single brass stamp. The brass itself lay innocently on the checklist where it had landed, looking as antique stamps often look, slightly resentful at being used, but dignified nonetheless. Norman picked it up. It was cold. He held it between thumb and forefinger and imagined, for reasons of nervousness and a late fondness for drama, that he could feel the weight of consequences. He tried to reconstruct the path. He had been reaching for the teapot. The sandwich wobbled. The stamp had slipped. He made diagrams in the margins of his notebook as if he were drafting a will. The diagrams looked like a child's map of a very small island civilization. From the diagrams he proceeded to recreate the sequence, which was where the Quarry 12 got involved. It hummed as if approving his attention. "We need to call procurement," Area said at last. "Because there are certain offices that must be called even when calling them is like trying to reason with a very dignified tree. We need to file an incident report. Someone must take responsibility." "Responsibility is sometimes a shared thing," Norman murmured, and if his words had weight, they would have been measured in paper clips. It is partly mine." He could say it now because the brass was in his hand, and confession is easier when you can illustrate the crime. The room watched him say it because the human need for witnesses is incompatible with solitude. He felt small. He also felt unexpectedly, as if someone was watching over his marginalia. "You did not mean to," Area said, and her voice cracked as if pen ink had flaked off. "Intent is not the issue. Precedent is. What do we do?" Norman asked, which is the question that starts most plots and many internal investigations. "First," Area said, "we do not let directorate make assumptions. Second, we go to the archive, the protocol archive." The archive was the kind of place that smelled like dust and decisions. It was arranged with the confidence of decades and the slight despair of an institution that had once hoped better. The room was dim and full of catalogues whose labels hinted at events it was uncharitable to remember. There were indexes bound in leather that had once been polished by hands that knew how to be absolute. The doors clicked shut in ways that suggested solemnity, and the lights shivered the way old chandeliers do when they have stories to keep. Gideon moved through the stacks like a man in his native marshland. He turned up an old volume that had been classified with a delicacy bordering on pity. It was a manual of sequences, an artifact of when the cosmos still held public consultations with its engineers. He read aloud to the room in a voice that trembled slightly around the edges of modernity. "Here," he said, "here is a reference to an activation protocol. It is archaic. The token we saw is annotated. It says he hesitated. It says the activation requires an affirmatory impression and a sequence." The stamp's imprint was interpreted as affirmation. Someone assembled the sequence, and the system complied. Which is to say, Tom observed, that if you happen upon an official stamp and press it on the right form by accident or design, you will receive an apocalypse. "This is poor Ux. This is a catastrophic user experience," Clara agreed, very adult and grammatically correct. As if in answer to the room's attempt at levity. A tiny trimmer trickled down the building, and a fountain outside stalled mid-arc like a dancer freezing on a particularly dramatic pose. The intercom ticked once and played an old procedural chime that had been retired with the last serious cosmic reform. When the chime stopped, there was a silence in which the whole department seemed to be holding its breath until water could remember how to fall. In the back of the archive, behind a ledger so thin you might have used it as a bookmark, Norman found a slip of paper barely large enough to be called a footnote. It was yellowed and apologized for its own verbosity. The line he read there was a single, bureaucratic apology. Remedial action permitted by Form P arm revocation triplicate copies, notarized, and requiring signature of someone very important. See Charter Clause 2. 1 and marginal note from S. Hargreaves, clerk circa year 43. The room blinked as though it had been administered a legal tonic. Form P arm revocation, Norman said aloud, tasting the phrase like a medicine he did not want but might have to swallow. The words themselves fell like small weights onto the floor of the archive. Triplicate copies. Someone very important. Notarization. Someone very important, Tom repeated, with that measuring smirk that suggested he had seen important people once at tea and found them wanting. It always comes down to someone who has a dog named after math and a librarian's card. Where is this someone? Norman asked, where indeed, Area said. It will be a personage of considerable inaccessibility. They enjoy tea and precedent. They do not like unexpected tidings. They all looked at Norman with a certain softness that belongs to people about to deliver bad decisions. And now, what do we do, Mies Vost? He asked. He felt absurd and responsible in equal parts, which is to say he felt precisely the right amount of human. Area folded her hands, her red pen resting like a small, authoritative raven on her palm. We document, she said finally. We contain. We contact directorate. We prepare to present evidence of human irregularity and appeal for remedial action. Norman closed the ledger with both hands. The brass stamp rested in his palm and felt suddenly heavier than its size justified. Outside, a city gave itself the small pleasure of arranging its pigeons into a line that resembled a queue for a public office. The fountain resumed its arc as if embarrassed. For a moment, standing between the rows of books that held the world's older mistakes, Norman could see the absurdity of it all as clearly as a well-edited paragraph. An obsolete stamp, a sandwich, a machine that loves to be literal, and an ancient clause with handwriting like a deeply polite afterthought. The world, he understood in a flash that was equal parts panic and revelation, had a footprint in paperwork. It had to be corrected with paperwork. The remedy resided in a form with the sort of name that suggested it had taken moral geometry in a former life. He thought of the small poem he kept folded in the bottom of his desk, a private assortment of domestic courage. He thought of his stapler and the calming rhythm of its click. He thought of a woman who kept biscuits in her drawer in case anyone felt badly about being alive. The prospect of losing those small, ignoble beauties because of an honest mistake made a cold, efficient fury coalesce behind his sternum. "Then we will find the form," he said. The declaration of that sentence felt more like a soldered joint than an emotional outburst. He had been moved from his usual career because a career could be moved by a single failed exam and a life of punctuality into a crisis where forms meant everything. He spoke, and the sound of his own voice felt like a small lever pulled in a machine that might still, perhaps, be forgiving. "We will," Area agreed. "But we will have to explain the activation and show good cause. The revocation requires someone very important signature. This is going to be about precedent and proving that the activation was accidental and that its effects are still reversible. And if it's not reversible?" Norman asked, extremely small. Aria's eyes softened with the faintest indentation of pity. "Then," she said, "we will have done everything that is humanly possible." Outside the department, a city hiccuped once more. It was less a catastrophe and more an embarrassed cough. Norman sat down on the nearest crate of forms and felt the weight of responsibility like a well-creased folder. The brass warmed in his hand with his body heat and felt slightly less alien. He did not know where someone very important kept their tea. He did not know whether they enjoyed biscuits or preferred lemon cake. He knew only that there existed, in a footnote, a route forward, a way to apply human testimony and the right signatures to the correction of an error of immense scale. It was a bureaucratic rope, prosaic, technical, and incomprehensibly vital. When he returned to his desk, Norman went through the motions of ordinary work, because that was the only kind of courage his hands knew. He tucked the brass into a small felt pouch he kept for sentimental office relics, and made a note in the margin of his day planner that read, "Find form PR revocation." He underlined it twice, as if underlining might force the world into coherence. If the day had been a paragraph, the misfiled stamp would be the comma that rewrote the sentence's meaning. The department that afternoon felt like a sentence waiting for the right clause. Outside, traffic resumed its indecisive rhythm, and a small nation passed an ordinance requiring a form for public applause. Inside, the Quarry 12 hummed softly and spat out a printout that invited them, in bureaucratic tones, to take responsibility. Norman folded the page into his notebook and, for the first time in a long time, felt the fierce, awkward, administrative possibility that sometimes accompanies the smallest human errors. He had always believed in forms the way other people believed in prayers, as necessary structures, ritual acts that made the world tolerably navigable. He had never expected, however, that his devotion to marginalia would be the precise kind of devotion that an obsolescent stamp would find interesting. He rose from his chair with the feeling of a person who has accidentally pushed the wrong button on the copy machine and must now race through the consequences with dignity. When the department convened to decide what to tell the directorate, Norman stood and offered, with a modest hand and a trimmer he hoped looked like professionalism, the brass from his felt pouch. It glinted like a small, archaic sun, and for reasons that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with human theater, looked guilty. "We should file an incident report," Aria said, and Norman, she glanced at him the way one consults a schedule. "You will write the first draft." He sat, palms slightly damp, and pulled out his pen. The Quarry 12 hummed in the background, as if approving the sound of human intent. Across the room, Tom winked, and Clara placed a biscuit in Norman's hand like a talisman for the upcoming storm. He began to write. He wrote the factual sequence with the care of someone listing the members of a family tree. He wrote the oddities, the pigeons that looked like envelopes, the fountain that had been embarrassed into silence. He wrote, finally, the phrase that felt like both accusation and plea, form PR revocation. Triplicate copies, signature required, someone very important. The line, inked in firm strokes in a margin that had known only neatness, looked like the beginning of a petition. It would not stop the hiccuping of continents. It might, he hoped, make a person somewhere very important listen. The department could only do what it always do in times of unprecedented clerical peril: file, explain, petition, and attempt to keep the kettle warm. Norman P. Ledger felt, for the first time in years, as if a file had been misplaced inside his chest. It began with a small, almost apologetic noise. The communal kettle hiccuped and gave a single, embarrassed wheeze, which in any other week would have been a charmingly human failing in an institution founded on the premise that errors can be corrected with a stamped form and a signature whose loops have been approved by committee. On that morning, the wheeze felt less like a flirtation with normality and more like a cough from an organ gone suddenly shy. He noticed the kettle first because he made it his business to notice small things, not out of greed for information or a hoarding compulsion, rather out of the simple arithmetic of a life spent turning possibilities into boxes to tick. Norman had perfected the ritual of arrival to the Department of Catastrophers: wash hands, check that the tiny stapler was present and accounted for, annotate the margins of the schedule ledger with a pencil that bit too soft for comfort, then perform the quiet liturgy of the tepid tea. The ritual was comforting for the same reason accounting was comforting. Everything could be accounted for, even if the accounts were of endings. On that Monday, the kettle's wheeze showed him that something wanted his attention and had chosen the least upsetting way to make itself known. A colleague would call this a harbinger. A supervisor would call it an irregularity with possible system-wide consequences, and File 32B, subsection 7. Norman called it a problem that deserved an annotated sticky note. The office itself had a way of insisting upon the absurd. Filing cabinets rose in improbable columns, like the ribcage of an administrative leviathan. Memos were stamped not only with dates but with little, calming phrases proceed slowly. Consider marginalia that served as the department's attempt to humanize the unstoppable. Area Vost, who could impose order on chaos with the blunt instrument of a red pen and make the same instrument seem sentimental, stood at the center of that particular gravity. She moved down the aisle toward Norman with the sort of decisive step that could reorder a cue and a heart simultaneously. Her bun was immaculate. Her lapel pin, a tiny clock face turned into a calendar, made a faint metallic click when she sat and removed her gloves. Norman folded his hands on the ledger, leaving a graphite impression like a small, temporary fingerprint. "We are trending out of spec." "Ledger," she said without irony, and the phrase had a way of making everything sound like it belonged to a report. Floor ticking in patterns. Teapot. Paperclip inventories fluctuating. Mr. Hall's poetry readings are 3 beats off. Any idea why? Norman swallowed the sentence he usually filed as "I don't know," and instead tried on a more helpful phrase. "A misfiled stamp can do strange things to the system, ma'am." A literalization can sneak in where metaphor lives a little too comfortably. Aria's red pen hovered over her own ledger, as if poised to sign off on his observation. "Be specific," he tried. He conveyed the sandwich incident of the day before his own buttered ham, the fall, the envelope's soft patter onto a clipboard. He mentioned the obsolete stamp had found and absent-mindedly used without checking its registry. He talked about the checklist had been updating and how, in the flurry of marginalia, he had tucked the stamp into drawer Q, where it did not belong. Norman said these things with the fervor of a man cataloging his guilt. She listened as managers listen, with small, sharp movements that suggested both calculation and a reserve of private sorrow. When he finished, Aria removed her gloves entirely and tapped the ledger twice in a rhythm that Norman recognized as appointment and admonition. "Go to the archive," she said. "Now, find file arm protocols, check the amendments, bring Gideon. If him to shield this office from an external review, I will need facts. Factual facts." There was a softness beneath the orders, a remembered fear. Norman wanted to say more, to ask whether she thought he had done it, to unburden the private tally of things that always seemed to require his hand, and had always come back to chastise it, but the department made people more efficient at not saying unnecessary things. He pocketed his tiny stapler and set off. The protocol archive was a place that made silence work so hard it practically had to sweat. Its stacks marched away into dimness under industrial lamps the color of office errors. The air tasted faintly of old paper and toner, and the kind of cold which read as formality in 3 languages. Gideon Furl met Norman near the microfiche reader, his bag of cables clutched like a rosary of technical absolution. "You smell it too, don't you?" Norman said, because saying something aloud made it less like a private confession. Gideon, who loved log files the way other people loved cats and loved them without irony, did not look up. Smell is imprecise. Logs are precise. Smells cannot be passed for timestamp fidelity. His watch was, as always, exactly 1 minute slow. Norman made a mental note. Gideon would be late on purpose if it meant everything else kept time. They rode a stupidly quiet freight elevator into the archive's belly, the sort of elevator that seemed intended for coffins of policy rather than people. The archive, when they arrived, greeted them with footnotes. It was not dramatic. The footnotes simply existed in layers, like strata of sediment showing where decisions had been laid down and then forgotten. Norman had grown up in a town that prized forms and punctuality. This was the geological record of that upbringing. They pulled up the checklist in question ragtag type, the kind of legalese whose commas looked like tiny, unnecessary territories. The microfiche reader coughed and projected a halting scene. An amendment scratched in a clerk's hand as if written by someone thinking simultaneously in ink and regret. Marginalia appended by people whose names were now signatures of drainage. See clause bureaucratic enforcement. See also on literalization. Another note, do not allow obsolete stamps to complete sequences under unattended sandwiches. Norman's stomach flipped with the clarity of the theft. Someone had once been concerned enough about sandwiches and stamps to mention them in policy. A small, human caution lodged in the bones of governance. Gideon scrolled through the logs. This machine misreads obsolete stamps as activation tokens if the checksum matches early protocol templates. It's a vestigial calibration from when physical artifacts had to be literalized to affect metaphysical scheduling. Someone tried to make it safer by requiring a manual override, but the override was later obsoleted by an amendment that never propagated to this reader. That sounded like a technical description. Norman translated it for his own purposes. The system was old, it had a sense of humor, and sometimes its humor tasted like disaster. They found, eventually, the file that made Norman's chest feel like a drawer gone missing. It was labeled in polite but final handwriting, P-ARM revocation necessary provision for reversal of activated Armageddon protocols. The title alone had a gravity. The word revocation made Norman think of rescinding a parking ticket. It should have been simple, fair, and administrative. But the document was not simple. It was not even administrative in the small sense Norman understood. It read like an attempt to harness mercy with a hydraulic system. The requirements were ornate in their cruelty. Triplicate copies in the correct chromatic order. Notarization by an authorized clerk with unblemished marginalia for no fewer than 10 years. Witness statements corroborated by at least 3 independent human acts of unprompted kindness documented by a non-departmental authority. And above all, the signature of someone very important. Norman read the last line 3 times. Someone very important was written with capitals and a faint, official quill that made the letters look tired. He looked up at Gideon. Gideon's fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on the reader. Someone very important is not a title. Technically, Gideon said, it is a designation. Historically, it has been used to refer to any number of reclusive administrators who exist outside normal departmental oversight. They enjoy tea. They have no small staff. They can be bribed with biscuits, but only in principle. In principle, Gideon shrugged. The clause is bureaucratic theater. It exists to prevent frivolous reversals. It wants ceremony and chaos both neatly constrained. Whoever wrote it was very afraid of precedent. Afraid of precedent. Norman felt the fear in his bones as something very familiar. He had been afraid of precedent his whole life. Precedent meant that one mistake could justify another, that once an exception was carved it might spread like a stain. He had lived by rules because rules were the only certain currency in a life of small failures. They read further. The document required that the revocation be filed with an attestation that the consequential anomaly had been minimized to the greatest extent practicable, and no non-trivial loss of narrative meaning would result from said revocation. It was bureaucratic poetry. It also asked, politely and perhaps insincerely, for proof that erasing the fiasco would not delete an entire story that ought to remain. Norman thought of small, messy human things, a child who would grow into a baker because of a half-missed bus, a small cafe that insisted on keeping napkin poetry in exchange for cheap coffee. He thought of his own life, which had been bent into order partly to keep those small human things safe. The idea that a signature could erase storylines felt like an eraser rubbed across a child's once beautiful drawing. When he closed the file, the archive sighed. Meh. Enoch, who had been sweeping the far stack with the patient devotion of someone who understood both mop and myth, looked up and said nothing at first. He had the look of a man who knew too many endings to be surprised by one more. "There are forms to undo endings," he said finally, in a voice like well-used paper. "There are. But they are awkward and need witnesses, and the signatures they require are held by people who change their minds on tea days." Norman wanted to ask whether there was a form to undo the tall, unwinding coil of humiliation that came with being the man who misplaced a stamp. Instead, he asked the question that people in the department ask when a problem has to be met by a system designed for the long patience of the cosmos. How do we get someone very important to sign? Mr. Anuch tilted his head in the way of those who speak in memories rather than advice. You do not get them to sign. You persuade them. You bring them the thing that is undeniable. Bring them an act of human goodness they cannot, in conscience, refuse. It was a moral puzzle disguised as a filing requirement. Norman felt the ledger of his life tilt. He had been good at small things at Staples and Marginalia, and waking up early to annotate the world. He had not truly tested himself with unpredictable kindnesses. He had been beholden to procedure rather than improvisation. Now, suddenly, an improvisation was required if he was to do something as pedestrian-sounding and existentially significant as rescinding an armed, awakened Armageddon. As they left the archive, the world made small and increasing displays of its irritation. One clock tower 3 streets over forgot that time was supposed to be an orderly procession, and instead took up a hobby of lagging suggestively. In a park, a corner fountain froze mid-arc. The water poised like a trompe-l'oeil sculpture until it found the courage to resume and belched into an embarrassed spray. Pigeons reorganized themselves into a pattern someone later described as possibly writing an acronym. Phones in a distant city started inserting unnecessary "please hold" messages into the middle of people's sentences. The department's phone lines developed minor metaphysical whines. Someone somewhere in London found that their name had been substituted on their passport by a generous footnote until the error was corrected with a politely worded apology from a bureaucrat who had nothing to do with the incident. A small island in the South Seas, known for its unexceptional climate and surprisingly good custard, adopted the habit of stamping its mail twice in triplicate for reasons its inhabitants had not articulated but found oddly satisfying. Norman watched these things happen like a man seeing dominoes that had once been sorted collide into emergent, disorganized shapes. He felt an urgency like a pen running low on ink. He went back to Area with the file tucked under his arm, and the tiny stapler clutched as if it might anchor him to a sense of self. Area read the P-arm revocation with a silence that was not empty. It was counting, as she always did, the cost in ways Norman could not know how to measure. "Triplicate," she said at last. "Witnessed kindness. Someone very important." She fixed her pen in a way that made the thing feel less like a weapon and more like a compass. "We have a responsibility, Norman, to those outside these walls and to the integrity of procedure. But we also have to be humans here. If there is a legal mechanism to repair however ornate we pursue it." She stood. "You will lead this." It could have been a promotion in a different world. In their world it felt like being asked to climb a mountain wearing a suit. Norman's hands trembled in a manner that was not only anxiety but also, he suspected, greediness. He had spent a life learning to keep lists for others. Now he had lists that might end the world. The responsibility felt ridiculous and ancient at the same time. "How do I even begin?" he asked, because beginning was what he did best. He reminded himself that beginnings could be boxed and labeled and annotated. If a problem could not be catalogued, then it could not be solved. Area rounded on him with a new softness. "Begin by procuring allies. Begin by telling the truth. Begin by refusing to let this office use procedure as an excuse for cowardice." "And Norman," she added, the red pen resting like a small, waiting sword in her fingers, "do not let the directorate make spectacle of this. If they want to parade precedent, we will parade humanity." Outside, a clock fell slightly behind and then caught up again as if embarrassed. Norman left the meeting with a list already forming in his head, Gideon for technical access. Mida. Enoch for whatever ancient knowledge mops would have, Rita for union leverage, Tom Chalk for lateral thinking, and Azra if Azra could be convinced to like paperclips. That night when the office lights buzzed their discordant little chorus and Norman sat under a lamp that smelled of dust and toner, he opened the file one last time. The PR revocation did not simply demand a signature. It demanded that the signature be earned in a particular moral narrative. It asked that those who would petition for mercy be able to show mercy enacted through unprompted human acts. It required triplicate copies because the cosmos, apparently, liked its mercy verified. He made his marginalia with a hand that shook only slightly. He wrote, in small, tidy letters, "We will try, we will ask, we will find witnesses. We will document small goodnesses. We will find someone very important if they take tea, and present them with a truth they cannot deny." It was the sort of margin note that could have been filed under optimism or delusion. He underlined it twice. The stapler felt warm in his palm. Outside, the fountain coughed and then resumed, and somewhere a pager he did not recognize emitted a polite tap. The world, it seemed, had caught Norman's tentative decision and was hiccuping in nervous approval. He closed the file and felt, for the first time that day, that his misfiled stamp might be not merely a source of shame, but the first line of a long and oddly human argument with an inflexible system. He left the archive with a new determination to convert anxiety into action, to trade marginalia for deeds, and to learn, for once, how to improvise without first checking the clause book. If the cosmos required forms to be satisfied, he would procure them. If it demanded witnesses of kindness, he would find them. If someone very important liked biscuits, then biscuits would be procured with exacting tenderness. Thus did Norman P. Ledger embark upon a procedural sprint that was, in truth, the beginning of a mad and marvelous, properly bureaucratic odyssey. The forms were, after all, only the shape of the solution. The substance would be human, messy, and utterly, ridiculously alive. He walked back into the office and found his colleagues clustered around the tepid kettle in a minor parliament of concern. Arya watched him with an expression that balanced approval and a small, anxious hope. Norman placed his tiny stapler on the table between them as if offering a pact, and when Tom Chalk stepped forward with a smirk so permanent it was practically a policy. Norman felt the first warm pricklings of community. They would need lists, witnesses, biscuits, magic, and cunning. They would need courage in small measures and obstinacy in large ones. They would need to show the cosmos that some mistakes could be corrected, not by erasure, but by amendment and mercy. Somewhere, faintly, the kettle sighed again. For the Department of Catastrophes, that was about as much hope as one could reasonably expect, and yet for Norman, it was everything. He wrote a new marginal note: start with the archive, find witnesses. Keep tiny stapler close. Do not faint in front of Auditor Primus. He underlined the last clause twice.